Major policy shifts at the federal and state levels are affecting nonprofits across the country. Today, Ivan and I will talk about how nonprofit leaders can effectively navigate this unfamiliar landscape. Hi, Ivan. Thanks for being with me today.
Yes, good afternoon. Good to be with you, Michelle.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and get started and talk about what's happening at the federal level. So what are the most significant policy changes at the federal level that are affecting nonprofits that you've seen emerge this year in 2025?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say is most of us are having to focus a lot more on federal policy than we probably have in many years. And so it's just been a whirlwind of things. We can start with the number of executive orders. I think we're over 150 at this point, and I think about the fact that many of those are focused really on identifying what this current administration's priorities are, and then having that sort of infiltrate through the rest of the federal government through different departments and things. So obviously a lot of things around anti-DEI, thinking about that work. I think we also have to talk about just the impact of federal funding within organizations. We have the executive memo that came out back in January that luckily, like the National Council put a lawsuit up that gave it an injunction so that it didn't take in effect the way that they wanted it to. I think the thing that we should be taking into account for that is that federal funding and its relationship to nonprofits is changing. And so I think those things obviously are really big for us, knowing that nonprofits rely on federal dollars in order to do the work that we do in communities across this country. We also think about just the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill into law earlier this summer, and what those impacts really are. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say it is harmful to many organizations and to communities across this country when we look at things like the cuts to SNAP and the cuts to Medicaid there. But I think we also have to celebrate there was a small win that also was in there. When we look at something like the Universal Charitable Deduction Act, which is desperately needed in terms of getting more folks giving to nonprofits now that we've got higher standard deductions. And then we've also got things that, maybe aren't as much policy, but in terms of the way in which the administration and leaders are sort of interacting and just talking about nonprofits. We've got, using the IRS and the Johnson Amendment that's been going on of recent. And so, we haven't seen that before. And, the thing I like to remind people is that Rich right now, 501c3s are still expected to be nonpartisan. That was really just about these two churches that are involved in that lawsuit. And we've got a really great blog post that David Heinen, our Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy, did. Because as you can imagine, many people hear things that are happening at the federal level, or they hear a news story or read a headline. And so right now, nonprofits still need to be nonpartisan. And so I think those sorts of things. And then just sort of the last couple of things is really just this sort of way in which people are talking about nonprofits, talking this hostile rhetoric, and really delegitimization of our sector, and talking about harmful rhetoric around that. And so when we say things like that nonprofits are nothing more than a gigantic scam, that nonprofits are serving an agenda that isn't serving the needs of American citizens, those sorts of things, allow for folks to then say, well, we're going to siphon off these nonprofits, or sort of the good nonprofits. These are the bad nonprofits. And at our core, all of nonprofits are operating in terms to fill needs and make communities better. Many times serve as these sort of invisible backbones across our communities. And then lastly, just this whole conversation that we're having really publicly around nonprofit tax exempt status and increased scrutiny that is happening, where many organizations are sort of living in this sort of fear of what happens if, I get a letter. And so it's just a really sort of chaotic and trying time for nonprofits. And I think, this isn't, while it is a challenge, it's not necessarily the worst, this isn't the first time that nonprofits have been here, we've had different periods of times where there have been focus on how do we sort of trim government spending, how do we look at how we are using our dollars. So we've seen some of these things before, also during the civil rights era, many organizations that were doing work around trying to bring about integration, they were being targeted by the IRS and sort of being threatened with revoking tax exempt status. And so I just think now everything is just very heightened around that. But we've had attacks on the sector before.
I think that's what's been the most, unsettling for me watching all of these changes is nonprofit organizations have always been partners with government, federal, state, local levels. And the government agencies have always used nonprofits to meet the needs of constituencies that the federal or state agencies just aren't positioned to do. So I'm really paying attention to that shift in dynamic. It isn't just about federal funding limitations or removals or restrictions. It really is this sort of fundamental shift in what has long been a collaborative partnership between agencies and nonprofits.
Yeah, absolutely. That relationship is changing.
100%. And we're not just seeing it at the federal level, we're seeing it in some respect at the state level, different states across the country. And so in North Carolina, what are some of the positive or negative trends that you're seeing in terms of policy shifts there as well?
Yeah, I mean, from a positive standpoint for North Carolina, I think one of the things that I think is helping us not have a complete, copy of what is happening at the federal level is the fact that North Carolina is operating really with sort of a divided government. So we have one party, the Democrats, are really in positions of leadership when in Council of State positions, governor, attorney general, things like that. And then Republicans are controlling the House and the House of Reps and then the Senate for North Carolina. And so I think, while there is some gridlock that comes with that, I do think what that does allow is a little bit of sort of like, we're just not going to copy sort of policy all the time from another place, whether that's a national organization or what's happening in another state. And so I think that allows really to sort of slow down and maybe have a little bit more like deliberative thinking on what sort of policy looks like. So I look at that as sort of a bright spot for us in North Carolina that many states necessarily may not be experiencing at this moment. We have also, from a policy standpoint, how it impacts our budget, like we've been able to really luckily have really high reserves from a revenue standpoint. And so that has allowed, I think, certain investments to be able to be made at the state level. I mean, I can say that, like, are we investing at public education in the levels that we need to, and sort of early childhood, those sorts of things? No, but right, like we are doing better than where a lot of our neighboring states are around many of those things, because we've been able to, we have a lot. North Carolina as a state that, companies are moving to. There's a lot of growth that is happening. And so that's good for us from a revenue standpoint when it comes to the state. I would be remiss if I also didn't talk about, like, we've also had the worst natural disaster that our state has seen in a number of years, and in an area that really wasn't expected to see that, right? And so, there are some challenges that we will be having for years to come on what does that look like in order to support and the, rebuilding, the development of Western North Carolina and making sure that it builds back stronger, more resilient. And so that takes dollars, right? So we just have when we think about some of the negative trends, we've got a lot of competing things that are going to be happening when it comes to budgets. And I think, it's going to be hard for nonprofits that are reliant on state dollars through appropriations or contracts. I think that where that's going to end up coming is that it could be a double whammy for organizations. We do have opportunities when we look at things like being able to support early childhood and education. But at the same point in time, we've got these sort of approach to tax policy and our tax rates in North Carolina that are really going to begin to set us up for some challenges down the road, and without even getting into the fact that we will have cuts potentially to Medicaid and SNAP, that the state is going to have to wrestle with what are we going to do. And so if they are going to try to close some of those gaps, it is going to come at a cost at some other aspects of our budget. And so I think we're going to be setting ourselves up that we're going to have some challenges when it comes to state funding of nonprofit organizations and competing priorities when it comes to budgeting.
And so that kind of gets into the, understanding how the federal policy changes and the state policy environment might be interacting, from a funding perspective. Are there other areas where you're seeing impact on nonprofits in North Carolina that's related to sort of this either alignment or misalignment of federal and state policy changes?
Yeah, I would say for us, I mean, the federal government had DOGE in place for a few months and was really sort of using a lens of like, how do we sort of root out waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, misuse of funds to trim. And so, North Carolina is going to have a similar effort here called DAVE, which is the Division of Accountability, Value, and Efficiency. And so, I think we're going to see this sort of copycat legislation, copycat actions by the fact that, when we look at federal policy as it relates to what may happen in North Carolina. So we're beginning to see that kind of copycat legislation or copycat priority. We also have seen a similar sort of anti-DEI measure that sort of took the anti-DEI executive orders and localized it to North Carolina. I will say that, one of the things that we're really proud about in North Carolina is the fact that we've been able, just make sure that it's not as far reaching as it could have been. Right now, the focus is really on state agencies. And so that was going to happen. And so we've tried to work to make sure that it's protecting nonprofits that are, continuing to do and focused and prioritizing the work that they were already doing to work around some of the inequities that we see in communities and where they have focus on solutions of equity in communities. And so those things, we've seen those sort of copycat legislations. And then, again, like I think where the federal government impacts with the state government is where their decisions around funding and what that means for state dollars. And so I think a lot of that is yet to be seen of what the impact of that is going to be. But we know that it is going to impact, the state budget.
One of the things that I've been hearing about out of North Carolina, and I don't think that it was implemented by the legislature, was this idea of somehow treating nonprofit organizations like state agencies for sort of audit perspectives.
Yes.
Tell us a bit more about that. Like what it is, what was driving it.
So I think a lot of it was tied more to this anti-DEI work that was trying to be passed, right? And so looking at like if you were receiving dollars from a private foundation that had a focus on racial justice or DEI, then that would put you in violation because of also the fact that you were getting state dollars. And so then that would cause the audit that would also hold the organization liable for, criminal charges potentially. I think it was a really harmful, problematic language that initially was in that legislation. And so that is some of the work that the center and some with partners in North Carolina, I think a lot of times people don't think about the unintended consequences of what that would look like. And so we've been able at this point to not have that in it. The governor did veto the anti-DEI legislation for state policy. And so all of that language was removed. And so until everything was sort of the dust has settled, we weren't sort of counting that was going to necessarily still be there. But yeah, I think it was really more around trying to root out DEI across the board. And I think that it might have been a step too far with that, knowing that nonprofits from a funding standpoint, many organizations do take funds from state funders and also from foundations. And so again, many of those foundations are private that folks are receiving dollars from. And so they can't, there's just no way for everything to be in alignment. And many nonprofits even, were concerned that it's a really interesting dynamic to think about. I may have one foundation who's asking for what my commitment to equity and my equity statement is, and then to have another funder who's like, we don't want any mention of it. And so there's already this sort of jumping through hoops that's having to happen around funding and in this moment. So we're grateful that actually did not come to bear.
Good. So you mentioned earlier, one misconception related to a recent federal case around the IRS and two churches and, nonpartisan. What other misconceptions are you hearing in terms of, with all of these changes, happening at the federal or state level, what are some misconceptions that you'd like to try to right?
Yeah, I think a really big one that I've heard, is that philanthropy can just make up the difference of what the federal government is no longer funding. And you're laughing, so I guess I'm going to take that as you have heard this several times as well, or that there's this sort of assumption that like, yeah, you're just going to go write a grant for these dollars. And we know that may work for some things. It's not, going to work for everything.
It's not the universal solution.
No, absolutely not. And of course, all of my foundation friends are freaking out when they hear that. They're like, we can't fund this. There's not enough money to go around. And, we use this statistic like in North Carolina, right? That you can take the assets of the 25 largest foundations in North Carolina, and their assets combined are right around $18 billion, right? And so, again, when we were looking at things like some of the Medicaid funding cuts and things like that, we're talking $6 billion is sort of on the line. And so I think many times people don't realize like the scope and the size of what federal dollars do in states and philanthropy, while they might, even if you could picture a world that philanthropy would just liquidate all their assets, that's going to help us for maybe 2 years. And then what? And so I think like the more that people really understand that really isn't going to be the path to fix this or to solve all the problems, I think that helps people realize that. But it's hard, right? When people think, there's a foundation that has billions of dollars in their endowment, they can do this. And it's like, no, they can't. But I think that also just speaks to a lack of uncertainty about like philanthropic institutions and what grant making looks like. So that would be one for sure. Now, I think the other thing I hear a lot, and I know we're all tired of politics at this point, unfortunately, right? Because it's just gotten so divisive and there's such a, winner takes all and it's not really collaboration happening in it. Is that many organizations say things like, I don't receive any federal dollars. So I don't have anything to worry about. I can kind of check out and I think that's sort of, limiting to not be mindful about like the downstream impact of what all of this does. And I use just this example of, if people are losing funding, everyone's natural thing is they're like, we have to replace it. And so right now, the pool of funders, right? I think there's maybe about like 1,200 foundations in North Carolina, right? Like, yeah, we may gain a couple of new foundations here and there, but that pie really isn't getting any larger from that standpoint. I mean, yes, we can grow individual donors, that kind of stuff, but all that works take time. And so I think organizations are kind of thinking none of this really impacts them or that they don't need to think about the work that is happening at the federal level or state level when it comes to policy around nonprofits. I think that they're sort of kidding themselves that it may have some, trickle down impacts to them, but that it does. And then I think the last sort of misconception is that a lot of times people feel really helpless and that they think there's nothing they can do. And we've seen the power of using collective voice to sort of push back, to be able to share stories, to get people to recognize what the impacts are. And so the more that we are doing that, I think that that's helping people really see the impact of changes and legislation. But at the end of the day, we have to do something. And so helping people recognize that their voice does matter. Maybe it may not matter as much as one person, one nonprofit, but when we can do things in a collective way and try to stand in solidarity and use our voice collectively, we are able to maybe slow down or lessen the impact on something as well. And it helps us in the long run.
Right. And, your example of the impact of anti-DEI legislation in North Carolina, I think is exactly that kind of example, pulling together and that one voice from a collective group. Your point about understanding those downstream impacts of what's happening from a policy perspective is really important. Lots of people can view it as that's happening over there and I'm happening over here. So helping organizations understand that it has sort of this global impact. Now that said, are you seeing any particular kinds of nonprofit organizations that are being most affected by these changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a tiered approach, right? I think first and foremost, any organization that receives federal dollars are really some of the ones that are on the front lines of sort of some of these policy changes, right? Because their relationship with the federal government or the state government is very entrenched there. I think the other thing that sometimes we don't always think about when we think about some of the impacts of just the fact that these sectors that and organizations that are in conflict with this administration's priorities and view of how Americans should be. So, talking about things like immigration, refugee services, environment and climate advocacy organizations, civil rights, social justice organizations, right, that may not even have some of these focuses but may have part of their work that's tied to supporting LGBTQ plus communities, reproductive rights, or have any sort of named race priorities or equity focused an approach. Those types of organizations also, because they are right now, unfortunately, targets in the administration just around just their commitment to the work that they are doing. And so then I just think that, I think we have to also recognize that, like, honestly, all of nonprofits are really impacted by these policy changes, right? Like, I think it's not like it's the Olympics of who's going to be impacted the most here, but all organizations are. And I say that, like, even just from a lens of like just the uncertainty, the stress of leading right now in this moment, all of the ripple effects. Well, the example I used earlier around funding. I mean, if people are feeling like they were competing for dollars 4 years ago, they're really going to be competing for dollars right now. And so that is an impact. And then, we haven't even really talked about like even the sort of the economic piece of some of the things, like what are the impacts of, these tariffs that are happening. If tariffs end up impacting our inflation rates in the economy here, like nonprofits have had to weather, economic downturns in the past. And so those kinds of things have direct impact, right, on how individual donors behave and what it costs for organizations, to do their work. And so it really does have a downstream ripple effect.
And I think that, so few people understand the economic benefit of the nonprofit sector, the number of people that they employ, the impact that they have on the people who they serve, and then those people's ability to be part of the economy, and just huge economic impact in states. And it's interesting that nonprofits have had that level of impact despite the fact that for the most part they've never ever really been paid the true cost of what it takes to deliver their services. So they're already going into this situation with uncertainty as it relates to their financial sustainability. And so what are you hearing from nonprofits about what they're thinking their sustainability is with everything that's going on?
Yeah, I would say, from a sustainability standpoint, I think it's uncertain, right? Like, I mean, organizations are thinking about, there's the threat of money being taken from our organization. And so like, then there's this looming cloud of like, is it going to be taken away? Is it not? I also think folks are trying to be proactive and work to replace money that may be in jeopardy or that is sort of on shaky ground. And then, organizations are thinking about like, what are some of the drastic changes that we may need to make? And I think that's hard for our sector to do. Right. That's a hard truth. That's hard for our sector to think about. Maybe we have to stop doing this program right now, or we have to change it, or we've got to think about how do we, merge this program with another organization, or, even like, what does it look like for me to still care about the mission of how I started this organization 10 years ago? And maybe it now needs to have a different life cycle that it is now with another organization. And so, our sector just doesn't have as much experience with sort of mergers and acquisitions and sunsetting in the same way that if you look at our colleagues and peers that are on the, small business side, on the for-profit side, like, many of those sorts of things happen all the time. And so I think that's hard for us. But I think that when we look at sort of the sustainability of organizations, all of those things are on the table.
Are you starting to see, or have you already seen nonprofits reducing their services or having to turn away clients?
Yes, it's already happening. And many organizations, right, have already started sort of raising the flag to say, yes, these SNAP changes, these SNAP cuts, funding, are going to have impact our ability to be able to feed families and communities that are going to need our help. And so, again, all of that's tied to the economic uncertainty of what may come, right? So we may be faced with this sort of cut in funding while the demand for services is rising at the same point in time. And then I think also like most leaders don't want to have to cut the services, right? Most organizations, that's not why they are in existence, right? If you think about nonprofits were started to fill gaps, to meet community needs. And so that's a hard place. And so that's not the place that organizations want to start with having to do, right? Like we want to try to figure out like, well, are there other ways we can do before we have to like impact what our clients and what our communities are going to get from us? And so that's where, where are there ways to trim money out of budgets? What does it look like for us to reduce staff hours, those kinds of things in order before we have to make those kind of decisions. And so, those are really hard decisions that organizations are in this place of having to make.
And so as we look at the future and how leaders need to respond, what would you say are the top 3 actions that nonprofit leaders should take kind of immediately to start to reduce the effects of these policy changes and funding changes?
Well, I think the first thing is like, if you're not doing this, to start planning for what any of the possible changes, impacts could be, and start having conversations with board and staff around that, and to create a culture of that and looking at where are our risks, what is happening, how might this impact us, what may be some paths that we could take. I think I would also say stabilizing and diversifying your funding as much as possible. And then really leaning into like communication and trying to be as transparent as possible internally and externally.
How do you see the role of boards of directors in this new environment? Should they be involved in kind of the strategic planning around this? What would you recommend to boards?
Yes, I would say this is a moment for board leadership and for board engagement. And I think it's hard, right? Like nonprofit boards, have volunteers that have busy and full lives outside of that organization. And I think, we've had nonprofits have already been through a period of time that's been sort of tough, right? COVID, all the other sort of changes that have been going on. And so, but this is a moment that boards need to lean in and support and be a thought partner to their executive and leaders in the organizations. I think boards have a responsibility right now to understand what is going on in the sector and how it impacts the organization. I also think the boards have a responsibility to help shape public policy and the advocacy agenda as it relates to their organizations and be willing to engage with that work. And so whether that is being willing to speak to elected officials, helping with the visibility of the organization right now, and getting the stories of impact out. But this is a moment for them to really sort of dig in with that. And then I think also in this, I will admit this is hard, but I think the boards also have a responsibility to help keep the advocacy in this moment focused on the issues at play and the impact and not partisan. And so I think that is a muscle that it takes lots of practice on doing. And so, but if I'm working for, a food bank organization, we need to be able to talk about as a board and as staff what the impacts to cuts to SNAP are going to do for our organization and for the folks that we serve. And to me, that is part of strategic planning processes, thinking also about like, where might there need to be some changes to our strategy? All of that stuff needs to be happening in partnership with board and staff.
And, knowing that that's not an easy thing to do, would you recommend organizations have facilitators? Are there resources that the center is creating or thinking about creating to help with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, so much of it is also around like where your board is and where their sort of appetite is. I've been really fortunate to be able to be in organizations that I look at my board as a partner in order for me to carry out the work. But I also know not every leader has that. And so it's going to look different based off what that relationship looks like. And so, one of the things that we have been thinking about is that there's not a lot of support for boards in this moment. And so we're starting to have some conversations with some consultants and folks around what may be some toolkits, what can be some things that maybe help organizations begin to enter into these conversations. One of the things that I say all the time is that even getting board chairs of organizations to make sure that they're getting policy emails from the center in a way that they can take that and then think, how might this be impacting my own organization, so that they can be the person that's helping to bring that stuff. Because the executive sometimes may not be the person that feels comfortable to bring those kinds of conversations up within organizations. And so it is something for us that we're starting to explore, but there are many, sort of board resources that exist with the center and Board Source and many other organizations, really around like how to bring sort of strategic thinking into board meetings, how to create a space for folks to have strategic conversations and sort of future forward conversations in board meetings, and get out of just we're reporting on the finances, we're reporting on the program numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, now is a time, like if ever, that we should be like moving and evolving boardroom conversations into strategic conversations and pushing all that stuff that really could have been an email into the email.
Yes. So you mentioned also, that there are some benefits in the One Big Beautiful Bill for nonprofits around tax policy changes. And so with that, there's the good and the less than good, but how can donors and funders start to better support nonprofits through these transitions, particularly in that context?
Yeah. So I'll maybe speak to funders on the funder side around this. And I mean, I think it's really important for funders to get that, how difficult it is for nonprofits in this moment, and for them to think about how might they be adding barriers, creating more hardship for them. And so I think, we are in a moment that's similar to COVID in some respects with some of the uncertainty. And so I would challenge funders and foundations to do more of what they did around COVID, which is streamlining their grant applications and their reporting. It is general operating grants and multi-year funding, if possible. It's like if you're got a 3-year grant to an organization where you're able to pay out early, pay out early. And, the really big one is work with your board trustees around increasing grant making dollars if that is something that is available on the table. I also think funders in relationship to nonprofits in this moment, there's the opportunity to support nurturing the possibility of innovation within the sector right now. It may feel like that we don't have a lot of options right now, but for many of us, like capacity building organizations, infrastructure organizations, philanthropy consultants, all of that kind of stuff, like this is the moment for us that we are able to think about this kind of stuff. I mean, nonprofits are going to have to reimagine the work going forward and in a dramatically different future, especially as it relates to government funding. And so we're going to have to help organizations rethink about how to meet their missions. And so I'd love to see foundations also continue to think about creative funding opportunities outside of C3 ventures and what that looks like. We don't know what's going to happen potentially to some organizations, and it just adds some more flexibility in order to make social change and community impact happen if we're not sort of constrained to some of the things that we've always been constrained with. And then, I would also recommend folks to remember that there are people that are working in and leading these organizations. And so funding nonprofit leaders and their teams' well-being during this time, I think, is critically important. And then funders, funding and supporting the infrastructure of the sector in this time.
You talked a lot about that sort of longer term adaptation and how we think about that from the funder perspective, which I think is critical. How do you talk with nonprofit leaders and helping them think about how they need to adapt to these new circumstances, including things like, what does it even mean to diversify funding and revenue streams? And how do they think about these things in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helping nonprofits get out of sort of the thinking only from a survival standpoint, right? And we know that it's going to take a different kind of thinking. It's going to require some deep adaptation, maybe even some reimagining, right, of the sector, which is hard when we're in the middle of crisis. We've got to rethink what sustainability and funding and resiliency and leadership and community impact is going to look like. And, if we're really honest, like our sector has some aspects that really weren't working well before. That weren't serving us. And so, I mean, you mentioned earlier in this some of the challenges around the funding and the way that we fund these organizations. And so we have a moment right now, right, that we can think about and reimagine and what is a possible different future of that looks like, and so that involves us having to think about the work differently. Is going to involve us being willing to try and experiment in order to make sure that we can still deliver on our missions and be there for communities. And that's going to require some collaboration. It's going to require us checking some egos. It may even require, right, like us saying, like, we may not be the organization that should be continuing to do this going forward. And, it's really easy to say these things and for you and I to have this conversation. But when you get down into it, right, there are nonprofits that have been started because it was someone's vision and dream. It was their lived experience. And so it's just not as easy.
No, there's that emotional connection to it, which is
Absolutely.
important. That's what drives.
That's why it exists.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that's why they're able to do the fundraising. That's why it's this labor of love. And I think we have to continue to hold and honor that while we are in this place of transition. And it just can't be these kind of transactional things that are happening, right? Like this organization and this organization need to sit down in a room and they need to figure it out. And it's like, that's not really how that's going to work. I mean, I think, ideally in a perfect world, right, it would be more natural and organic, and organizations could sit down as part of some of their planning and think, what would happen if we lost this, fourth of our funding? What does that, who might be partners that we need to begin to develop some relationships with now that maybe we can begin to date before we have to be in a situation, right, that's more sort of crisis and a place of crisis, and we feel like we have less options. And so, and it's hard, right, because that the collaboration piece of all of this requires time, requires trust, and it requires us to be our best sort of versions when we're doing that. And, if we're honest, nonprofits don't have a lot of that right now.
Right.
And I
They
think
don't have the capacity
right,
for it. Yeah.
right. And if funders aren't helping from funding standpoint or creating the space for it or the possibilities for it, it's not going to happen in a way that it could be really beautiful, and more positive.
And I think that's a really important point. That is, when we talk about these changes, it really needs to be viewed from a multi-stakeholder perspective, that it's not just the leaders of the nonprofits that need to figure it out.
Right.
So many partner, components need to be involved in that process. The idea of nonprofits advocating, I hear from nonprofits a lot, oh, we're not allowed to lobby. So how do you help nonprofits understand, the leaders and the board, particularly smaller organizations, understand what their role is in advocacy and in engagement on these issues, so that as we move forward, as the true impact is, we start to see the true impact, how can they take that information and advocate for changes going forward?
Yeah, I think that the first step of that is continuing to make sure every board, nonprofit leader understands, right? Like, yes, we can advocate. That's the baseline. And then I think from there, it's like helping organizations realize, like, every organization has to play some role in public policy advocacy, right? It looks different for every organization based off their own experience, their comfort, where they are as an organization around understanding their role in sort of advocacy and public policy. I think about like an entry point always is like organizations signing up for things like the center's weekly public policy emails and just being aware what is happening, right? And so that's a really great first step for organizations that maybe you're dipping their toe into recognizing like, whoa, all these things are happening that are impacting us. And I don't even know where to go or how to make sense of all of that. I think another point is for leaders that are more comfortable, like how are they bringing public policy into board meetings? And with their boards. And so whether that is they're forwarding those public policy emails and saying, making sure like you all know this, or pulling out some of the more salient things for them in their organization and creating space for board conversation with that. And then, another one could be like pulling folks that are working in similar spaces or have some sort of shared identity together to work on it, right? Like, I think we know right now we're in a moment that, yes, you could go and advocate for your own food organization, but like it's probably stronger right now for there to be a collective effort, right? And we're starting, we're seeing more organizations that are doing that. There's a group in the Triad in North Carolina, the Guilford Nonprofit Consortium and Hands On Northwest out of Winston-Salem. And so they've started ever since January, they've got this group that's called One Sector, One Voice Triad, and it's really designed around trying to have sector-wide responses to the public policy and the challenges and things that are happening for nonprofits in this moment. And so, those kind of opportunities give nonprofits that maybe say, we don't want to do this by ourselves, or we want some cover, to be able to be in community and have a collective response.
That's great. So as we come to the close of our wonderful conversation, what should nonprofit leaders do to prepare for the next 6 to 12 months? As you said, they're sort of in crisis, so they've got to get very clear on what to focus on. What would you say the next 6 to 12 months needs to look like?
Yeah, I would say, I think there's some intentionality that needs to happen right now, thinking strategically and realistically. I think there's a balancing of that. I would be doing things like conducting some sort of risk and scenario assessment of the organization. I'd be trying to build and sustain or strengthen the reserves of the organization, knowing that we're sort of in some uncertain times, being creative and proactive about fundraising. And then, going back to the board piece of this, I'd make sure that my board is ready for this moment and what may come, and that they should be strategic and responsive thought partners to the executive right now.
We've talked about what funders should do. We've talked about what nonprofit leaders should do. What would you say to the ordinary citizen? What can they do to support the nonprofit sector? Or just even a local nonprofit?
Yeah, I would say if you are connected to a local nonprofit in your community that you care about, number one, I would say check in with that nonprofit team and their leader. It's a challenging time for them. Do something like take some cookies one day or donuts, or take them lunch, and just recognize that, they're sort of managing and juggling a lot at this moment. Obviously, donating money with little or no strings attached to the money. We need flexible, general operating funds now more than ever. If you're in a position to volunteer on a regular basis, help that organization raise their awareness of the work that they do, stay informed with what's happening to the sector, and make sure your friends really know, and so they can, love on and support the organizations that they care about, and just recognize like we're going to need a collective response. And it doesn't take only gifts of, 6 figures to support nonprofits. It is small gifts, it's reoccurring gifts, it's in-kind support, but just really doing what you can for the organizations that are meaningful for you and your family.
So you mentioned the policy newsletter that the center puts out, and it is truly fantastic. And so I would recommend that all nonprofit leaders really do sign up for that. And then as we wrap up, is there new resources coming out, things that the center has coming up for nonprofit leaders in North Carolina to look forward to?
Yeah, so we do an annual statewide convening of nonprofit leaders that happens every fall. The dates of that are in late November, November 19th and November 20th. And so we'll be in the RTP area of North Carolina. And so definitely come and be in community with fellow nonprofit leaders and learn and be able to think about like the support that your organization needs going forward. And then I would say, go on the website and check out all of the other sort of upcoming webinars that we have that are really sort of right now tailored around meeting the moment for nonprofits. So thinking about diversifying your revenue streams. And so many of these webinars that we have done, if they've already happened in the past, they're available on the website a lot of times. And so again, like you can find those on the website. We are, as I said earlier, continuously thinking about how we can be support for organizations. And so that's the best place to sort of keep up to date with what is happening. And then, if you've missed those weekly public policy emails up to current date, many of the previous ones are cataloged on the website under the public policy page. And so David does a really great job of when there are really big things going on, like the tax bill and sort of what's going on with the IRS and the Johnson Amendment. So there's some really great sort of blog posts and writings that have many links to resources and background information. And so many of those are free to members as well as non-members as well. And so utilize those resources. And then if there's something that you're looking for and it's not there, I would ask folks to let us know so that we can help them find those and curate those things.
That's great. Well, thank you, Ivan, very much for being here with me today. It's been a highly informative conversation. We look forward to hearing from nonprofit leaders in terms of how things are going for them. As you said, sharing their stories, I think, is really important, and providing these kinds of resources will be very helpful for them. So thank you.
Absolutely. Great to be with you.
You too.